power is a funny thing. 1 minute, you are standing on the side of a rain-slicked highway, cold handcuffs biting viciously into your wrists, listening to the hollow, arrogant laughter of 2 men who think a tin badge makes them untouchable gods. The next, 5 years have passed, and you are sitting high on a mahogany bench, a wooden gavel resting lightly in your hand, looking down at those exact same men. They say karma is a mirror, but sometimes karma wears a pitch-black robe. This is the story of 2 corrupt officers who picked the wrong man to break, only to find him holding the absolute hammer to their shattered futures. The rain was coming down in relentless, heavy sheets across the asphalt of Interstate 95. It was past 2 in the morning on a dreary Tuesday in November. Isaiah Crawford, a 34-year-old defense attorney who had just spent 14 grueling hours preparing for a high-stakes corporate litigation case, was driving his silver Mercedes-Benz sedan back to his suburban home. He was exhausted. The rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers was the only sound keeping him awake, accompanied by the low hum of jazz playing through the car's speakers. Isaiah was a man of quiet dignity. He had fought his way up from a rough neighborhood, earned a full scholarship to a prestigious law school, and was already on the short list for a state judicial nomination. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, his tie loosened just a fraction after a brutal day at the firm. Behind him, emerging from the blurry halo of the highway streetlights, a police cruiser accelerated. Inside the squad car sat Officer Graham Matthew and Officer Brent Donovan. Matthew was a 14-year veteran of the force, a man whose gut hung over his duty belt and whose disciplinary file was thicker than a phone book, yet somehow always buried by the Union. Donovan was younger, a protégé who had quickly learned that wearing the badge under Matthew's guidance meant doing whatever you wanted without consequence. Matthew narrowed his eyes as the silver Mercedes passed them in the middle lane. "Look at this," he sneered, tapping the steering wheel. $100 grand on wheels. Run the plates." Donovan typed the numbers into the glowing laptop mounted on the dashboard. "Registered to an Isaiah Crawford. Clean record. No warrants. Address is out in Oakley Estates." "Oakley?" Matthew scoffed, a dark, prejudiced smirk twisting his features. He hit the accelerator, pulling up parallel to the Mercedes to peer through the rain-streaked windows. He saw Isaiah, a black man in a high-end luxury vehicle. Yeah, right. Probably stole it, or he's moving product. No way a guy like that lives in Oakley. Light him up. The red and blue lights exploded to life, reflecting violently off the wet pavement. Isaiah saw the lights in his rearview mirror and let out a tired sigh. He checked his speedometer. He was going exactly the speed limit. Both of his taillights were functional. His registration was up to date. He knew the law inside and out, but he also knew the reality of driving while black in this city. He immediately turned on his blinker, pulled over to the shoulder safely, turned off the engine, rolled down all 4 windows so the interior was visible, and placed both hands firmly on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. Matthew and Donovan approached the vehicle, their flashlights cutting through the torrential rain, intentionally shining the blinding beams directly into Isaiah's eyes. "License and registration," Matthew demanded, his voice devoid of any professional courtesy. "Good evening, officers," Isaiah said, his voice calm, measured, and deeply resonant. "My license is in my wallet, in my inside left suit jacket pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. With your permission, I will reach for them." "Don't get smart with me, boy. Just hand over the papers," Matthew snapped, shining the flashlight closer to Isaiah's face. Isaiah slowly reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and handed his driver's license to Matthew. He then leaned over slowly to pop the glove box, handing over the registration. Matthew snatched the papers, barely looking at them. "Whose car is this?" Matthew asked. "It is my vehicle, officer." "What do you do for a living that affords you a car like this?" Donovan chimed in from the passenger side, leaning in close, his tone laced with heavy skepticism. "I am an attorney," Isaiah replied simply. Matthew let out a harsh, barking laugh. "An attorney, right, and I'm the King of England. Step out of the vehicle." "Officer, respectfully, for what reason am I being asked to step out of my vehicle? Was I committing a traffic violation?" Isaiah asked, maintaining his perfect composure. "I said step out of the car, now!" Matthew yelled, resting his hand aggressively on the butt of his service weapon. The threat was not implied. It was overt and immediate, knowing that the side of a dark highway was not a courtroom, and knowing that dead men cannot argue their constitutional rights. Isaiah unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out into the freezing rain. Instantly, Matthew grabbed Isaiah by the shoulder of his expensive suit, spun him around with unnecessary force, and slammed him against the wet side of the Mercedes. "Spread your legs," Matthew barked, kicking Isaiah's ankles apart. He began patting Isaiah down roughly, his hands searching aggressively. "You got any weapons on you? Any drugs?" "Where are the drugs, counselor?" "I have nothing illegal on my person or in my vehicle," Isaiah stated, his cheek pressed against the cold metal of his car. His mind was racing, cataloguing every detail. Officer G. Matthew, badge number 4482. Officer B. Donovan, badge number 7193. "We'll see about that," Donovan said, opening the back doors of the Mercedes and beginning to tear through the pristine interior, tossing files and legal briefs onto the wet floorboards. "Do you have probable cause or a warrant to search my vehicle?" Isaiah asked firmly. "Stop resisting," Matthew suddenly shouted, twisting Isaiah's left arm violently behind his back. "I am not resisting," Isaiah said, loudly and clearly, ensuring his voice could be picked up by the cruiser's dash cam, if it was even turned on. The click of handcuffs echoed in the rain. Cold steel clamped down hard on Isaiah's wrists, tightened far beyond protocol, cutting off the circulation. Matthew pushed Isaiah forward, marching him toward the squad car. "You're going downtown, hotshot. We'll see how smart you talk when you're sitting in a cage." As they shoved him into the back of the cruiser, his suit soaked and ruined, his dignity temporarily stripped, Isaiah Crawford did not yell. He did not threaten them. He did not scream, "Do you know who I am?" He simply looked out the window, his jaw clenched, memorizing the faces of the two men who had just made the gravest mistake of their professional lives. The 42nd Precinct was a miserable place at 3 a.m. It smelled of stale coffee, industrial bleach, and human despair. Neon lights buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently as Matthew and Donovan marched a handcuffed Isaiah through the double doors. The officers were laughing about a sports game, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just kidnapped a citizen under the guise of the law. They brought him to the booking desk, manned by Sergeant O'Connor, an older, weary desk sergeant who barely looked up from his paperwork. "What do we got, Matthew?" O'Connor mumbled, taking a sip from a styrofoam cup. "Got a live one?" Matthew smirked, tossing Isaiah's driver's license onto the counter. "Pulled him over on 95, suspected DUI, erratic driving. When we asked him to step out, he got aggressive. Resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, failure to comply." Isaiah stood there, his hands still cuffed tightly behind his back, his wet suit clinging to his frame. "None of that is true, Sergeant," Isaiah said, his voice echoing in the quiet precinct. "I was perfectly compliant. I was not breathalyzed, nor was I offered a field sobriety test, because there was no suspicion of intoxication. This is an unlawful arrest." Matthew shoved Isaiah in the back. "Shut your mouth, you see?" Still resisting. O'Connor finally looked up, his tired eyes scanning Isaiah. He saw the tailored suit, the clear, articulate speech, and the absolute lack of panic. O'Connor had been on the force a long time. He knew the difference between a drunk belligerent and a man who was dangerously calm. But the blue wall of silence was thick in the 42nd Precinct. O'Connor wasn't about to stick his neck out for a stranger against two of his own, even if Matthew was a known problem child. "Empty his pockets. Put him in cell 4, O'Connor ordered gruffly. Donovan violently uncuffed Isaiah, shoved him against the counter, and emptied his pockets. They took his wallet, his keys, his phone, and his watch. Then Matthew grabbed him by the bicep and led him down a cold, cinder-block hallway. The holding cells were grim. Cell 4 had a single metal bench, a toilet with no seat, and a puddle of indeterminate liquid in the corner. Matthew shoved Isaiah inside. "Welcome to your new office, counselor," Matthew sneered through the iron bars as they clanged shut. "You can give legal advice to the drunks. Enjoy your stay." Isaiah stood in the center of the cell, listening to the echoing footsteps of the officers walking away, followed by the muffled sounds of their laughter. He took a deep breath, smoothing down the lapels of his ruined suit. He walked over to the metal bench and sat down. For the next 6 hours, Isaiah did not sleep. He sat in the freezing, damp cell, staring at the concrete wall opposite him. The anger inside him was a living, breathing thing, a hot coal burning in his chest. But Isaiah Crawford was a master of discipline. He knew that reacting emotionally in this building would only give them the excuse they desperately wanted to beat him into a hospital bed, or worse. The system was designed to break you in these early hours, to strip your humanity and replace it with animalistic fear. But they didn't know the mind of the man they had locked up. In those dark hours, Isaiah didn't plot violence. He plotted a surgical, legal destruction. He mentally drafted civil rights lawsuits, calculated internal affairs, complaints, and reviewed the criminal statutes for official oppression and false imprisonment. At 9 a.m., the heavy metal door at the end of the cell block groaned open. A different officer, a young deputy, walked down the corridor and stopped in front of cell 4. He looked at a clipboard, then looked at Isaiah. There was a nervous twitch in the deputy's eye. "Isaiah Crawford?" the deputy asked. "Yes." "Step up to the bars. I'm letting you out." The keys jingled, the lock turned, and the heavy door swung open. Isaiah stepped out into the hallway. "Where are my arresting officers?" Isaiah asked calmly. "Their shift ended at 6. They went home," the deputy replied, avoiding eye contact. "Follow me." Isaiah was led back to the front desk. Sergeant O'Connor was gone, replaced by a daytime supervisor, Lieutenant Gable. Gable looked deeply uncomfortable. Standing next to Gable was Daniel Hayes, a senior partner at the law firm where Isaiah worked, clutching a leather briefcase and looking utterly furious. Isaiah had used his one phone call at 6 a.m. to call Daniel. Daniel hadn't just come down. He had woken up the district attorney. "Isaiah, are you all right?" Daniel asked, stepping forward, taking in the wet clothes and the dark bruises forming on Isaiah's wrists. "I am fine, Daniel," Isaiah said. Lieutenant Gable cleared his throat. "Mr. Crawford, the district attorney's office has reviewed the preliminary report. All charges have been entirely dismissed. There will be no record of this arrest. You are free to go. We apologize for the inconvenience." Isaiah collected his belongings from the plastic bin on the counter. He strapped his watch back onto his wrist, slid his phone into his pocket, and pocketed his keys. He looked directly into Lieutenant Gable's eyes. "It wasn't an inconvenience, Lieutenant. It was a felony assault and a deprivation of civil rights under color of law," Isaiah said, his tone chillingly flat. Officers Matthew and Donovan falsified a police report. They conducted an illegal search. They assaulted me. Mr. Crawford, Gable said defensively. The DA dropped it. It's over. Let's just walk away. We keep our streets safe. Sometimes mistakes happen. Isaiah didn't yell. He simply nodded slowly. Mistakes happen, but they don't disappear. As Daniel drove Isaiah home, the senior attorney was fuming. We are going to sue the city, Isaiah. We are going to take their badges. We will tear this precinct down to the studs. Isaiah watched the city skyline pass by through the passenger window. He thought about Matthew and Donovan going home, kicking off their boots, drinking a beer, utterly convinced they had won, completely unaware that the man they had thrown in a cage was about to be confirmed as the youngest Superior Court judge in the state's history. No, Daniel, Isaiah said quietly. Daniel looked at him in shock. What? Isaiah, you can't let them get away with this. They profiled you. They abused you. I am not going to sue the city, Isaiah replied, his eyes cold and unblinking. A civil suit means a settlement paid by the taxpayers. Matthew and Donovan would get a slap on the wrist, a few weeks of paid administrative leave, and then they'd be right back out on the street doing it to someone else. Someone who doesn't have a senior partner to call. Someone who would plead guilty just to go home. Then what are you going to do? Daniel asked. I'm going to take my seat on the bench, Isaiah said softly. Men like Matthew and Donovan don't change. They escalate. They will hang themselves. And when they finally build a rope thick enough, I am going to be the one who drops the floor from under them. 5 years is a long time in the criminal justice system. It is enough time for memories to fade, for faces to blur, and for arrogance to crystallize into a dangerous sense of invincibility. For officers Graham Matthew and Brent Donovan, the last 5 years had been highly profitable. The incident with the black guy in the Mercedes had completely vanished from their minds. As far as they were concerned, he was just another guy who got lucky because a soft district attorney didn't want to press charges on a traffic dispute. They never learned his name. They never followed up. They were too busy lining their own pockets. Promoted to a specialized anti-gang task force, Matthew and Donovan were given a long leash by the department. They operated in the city's poorest districts, far away from the cameras and the wealthy residents of Oakley Estates. Their corruption evolved from casual brutality to organized extortion. They started shaking down local business owners for protection money. They skimmed cash from drug busts before logging the evidence. They planted unregistered drop guns on suspects to justify brutal beatings. They believed they were the apex predators of the city's concrete jungle, but they made a fatal error. They got greedy and they got sloppy. They began extorting a local pawn shop owner named Vincent Caldwell. What they didn't know was that Caldwell was already a confidential informant for the FBI, working off a federal tax evasion charge. The FBI equipped Caldwell with hidden audio and video recording devices. For 6 months, federal agents sat in unmarked vans, quietly drinking terrible coffee, recording every threat, every bribe, and every admission of guilt that spewed from the mouths of Matthew and Donovan. The hammer finally fell on a brisk Tuesday morning in October. Matthew and Donovan were sitting in their unmarked SUV, eating breakfast sandwiches, when 4 black FBI Suburbans boxed them in. Heavily armed federal agents dragged them out of their vehicle in broad daylight, stripping them of their weapons and their badges in front of a dozen civilian onlookers. The blue wall of silence couldn't save them from a federal-state joint corruption probe. The indictment was massive. 32 counts including racketeering, extortion, aggravated assault, evidence tampering, and perjury. Because the crimes violated both state and federal laws, the U.S. Attorney's Office agreed to let the state try the most severe violent felony charges first, ensuring they would be housed in a maximum security state penitentiary before the feds even got their turn. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Matthew and Donovan retained their unbearable arrogance. They hired a high-priced, slick defense attorney named Lawrence Sterling. Wait, let's call him Lawrence Conway. Conway was famous for getting dirty cops off the hook by manipulating juries and burying the prosecution in procedural delays. "Don't sweat it, boys," Conway told them in a private holding room beneath the county courthouse on the morning of their arraignment and preliminary hearing. The prosecution's star witness is a pawn shop owner with a rap sheet. The video is grainy. We play the hero cops operating in a dangerous environment card. Furthermore, I pulled some strings. The administrative judge assigning our case just retired. We drew a relatively new judge, a guy who's been on the bench a few years, keeps a low profile. We can bully him. "Who is it?" Matthew asked, chewing a piece of gum, looking bored in his tailored grey suit. He was currently out on a $2 million bail, paid for by the police union's emergency fund. "Judge Crawford," Conway replied, flipping through a file. "Honorable Isaiah Crawford." Matthew frowned slightly, the name scratching at the very edge of his memory like a phantom itch. Crawford. Sounds familiar. Did we ever bust a Crawford? Donovan shrugged. "We've busted half the city, Gra. Who cares what his name is? As long as he wears the robe and respects the badge, we're fine." The bailiff opened the door. "Mr. Conway, we are ready for you in courtroom 302. Matthew and Donovan adjusted their ties. They puffed out their chests, projecting the aura of untouchable authority as they walked down the marble hallway. They pushed through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302. The gallery was packed with reporters, FBI agents, and internal affairs detectives. The prosecution table was stacked high with boxes of evidence. Conway led his clients to the defense table. Matthew leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs, shooting a cocky, defiant glare at the lead prosecutor. He whispered a joke to Donovan, who stifled a laugh. "All rise." The deep, booming voice of the bailiff echoed through the cavernous room. Everyone in the courtroom stood up. "The Superior Court of Oakhaven is now in session. The Honorable Judge Isaiah Crawford presiding. God save the state and this honorable court." From the door behind the bench, a tall, imposing figure emerged. He wore the heavy, flowing black robes of a Superior Court judge. His posture was immaculate, his face a mask of absolute, unyielding authority. He walked up the steps and took his seat behind the elevated mahogany desk, looking down at the packed courtroom. Judge Isaiah Crawford adjusted his microphone. He looked out over the room, his eyes scanning the prosecution, the gallery, and finally settling entirely on the defense table. Matthew looked up at the bench. His chewing gum froze in his mouth. The blood drained from Matthew's face so fast he felt dizzy. His heart, which had been beating with steady, arrogant rhythm, suddenly seized in his chest. He squinted, his mind desperately trying to reject the image his eyes were sending him. It couldn't be. He looked at the judge's sharp jawline. He looked at the calm, intense eyes. He remembered a rain-slicked highway. He remembered a silver Mercedes. He remembered slamming this exact man's face into the side of a car, kicking his legs apart, locking handcuffs onto his wrists, and tossing him into a puddle of filth in cell 4. "You're going downtown, hotshot. We'll see how smart you talk when you're sitting in a cage." Matthew's own words echoed in his skull like a gunshot. Donovan, noticing his partner's sudden, pale paralysis, nudged him. "Gra? You okay? You look like you're gonna puke." Donovan followed Matthew's horrified gaze up to the bench. Donovan's eyes widened to the size of saucers. A soft, terrified gasp escaped his lips. The young, cocky officer suddenly shrank in his chair, feeling the crushing, claustrophobic weight of the room closing in on him. Judge Isaiah Crawford looked down at the two men. For 5 long years, he had waited for this exact moment. He had watched their names cross the docket. He had seen the charges. He had prepared his courtroom. Isaiah didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He didn't show an ounce of the anger he had felt in that concrete cell. Instead, he simply leaned forward, resting his hands on the heavy wooden gavel. "Good morning, gentlemen," Judge Crawford said, his voice deep, resonant, and carrying clearly across the silent courtroom. He locked eyes with Matthew, holding the corrupt cop's terrified gaze with the cold, immovable weight of the law. "I believe," Judge Crawford continued, his tone chillingly polite, "we have met before." The silence in courtroom 302 was absolute, thick enough to suffocate. The air conditioning hummed a low, droning note. But for Graham Matthew and Brent Donovan, the room had suddenly become a furnace. Matthew felt a cold bead of sweat trace a path down his spine. His knuckles, gripping the edge of the defense table, were stark white. Donovan looked like a man who had just watched his own execution scheduled on the calendar. Lawrence Conway, their high-priced defense attorney, was not a stupid man. He felt the sudden, violent shift in the room's atmosphere. He looked at his clients, noting their sudden pallor and the sheer terror radiating from them. Then he looked up at the bench. Judge Isaiah Crawford was a picture of serene, terrifying composure. "Your Honor," Conway said, finding his voice, though it lacked its usual theatrical boom. "The defense requests a brief recess to confer with my clients. A matter of sudden urgency has arisen." Judge Crawford's dark eyes flicked to Conway. He did not smile, but there was a profound, immovable weight in his gaze. "We have only just called the court to order, Mr. Conway. However, if counsel feels it is strictly necessary to confer before the preliminary reading of the charges, I will grant a 10-minute recess. Do not make it 11. "Thank you, Your Honor," Conway stammered. The bang of the gavel sounded like a cannon shot in Matthew's ears. Conway grabbed both officers by the arms, his fingers digging into their expensive suits, and practically dragged them into the adjacent holding room. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut, Conway rounded on them, his face flushed with professional rage. "What the hell was that?" Conway hissed, throwing his legal pad onto the small table. "You two look like you just saw a ghost. Did you recognize him? Did you threaten him? What did you do to the judge?" Matthew paced the small room like a caged animal, running a hand over his face. We know him, Larry." "Know him how?" Conway demanded. "Did you shake him down? Did you take a bribe from him? Because if you did, we need to file a motion for recusal right now before this goes any further." Donovan sank into a plastic chair, putting his head in his hands. "We didn't shake him down, Larry. We arrested him." Conway stopped dead. The blood drained from his face. "You arrested a sitting Superior Court judge?" "He wasn't a judge then," Matthew snapped, his voice cracking with panic. "It was 5 years ago. He was just some guy in a fancy suit driving a Mercedes. We pulled him over on 95. We roughed him up a little, threw him in a cell overnight. How the hell were we supposed to know he was going to end up wearing a black robe?" Conway stared at them, his mouth slightly open, processing the sheer magnitude of their stupidity. "You illegally detained, assaulted, and falsely imprisoned a lawyer who is now the judge presiding over your federal-state corruption trial. You have to be the two dumbest sons of bitches to ever wear a badge." "You have to get him off the case, Larry," Matthew pleaded, grabbing the attorney's lapels. "You saw the way he looked at me. He remembers. He's going to hang us. You have to file for recusal. Tell the court he has a conflict of interest." Conway shoved Matthew's hands away and straightened his jacket. He took a deep breath, his legal mind spinning. Fine. I will file the motion. We will go back out there, and I will state for the record that there is a documented history of animosity between the bench and the defendants. But I need the paperwork. What were the charges you filed against him? Resisting? DUI? I need the booking number. Matthew froze. Donovan looked up, his eyes wide with a new layer of horror. There is no booking number, Donovan whispered. Conway squinted. What do you mean there's no booking number? You said you threw him in a cell. We did. Matthew swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. But the DA tossed it the next morning. It was a bad bust. We knew it was a bad bust. So to keep internal affairs off our backs, we made the paperwork disappear. The desk sergeant expunged the log. Officially, the arrest never happened. Conway stared at them for a long, agonizing minute. A slow, chilling realization dawned on his face. He let out a breathless, humorless laugh. You erased the arrest to save your own skins, Conway said softly, pointing a trembling finger at them. Which means there is no official record of you ever interacting with Isaiah Crawford. So? Matthew demanded. Just tell him we remember. You absolute idiots, Conway growled, leaning in close. Don't you see the trap? If I go out there and file a motion for recusal based on a false arrest, Judge Crawford will ask for the proof. When I can't provide the police report, he will ask why. The only way to prove he has a conflict of interest is for you to confess, on the official court record, to falsifying police documents, kidnapping, and civil rights violations under the color of law, all of which are federal felonies that aren't even on your current indictment yet. The reality crashed down on Matthew and Donovan like an anvil. They had dug their own grave, paved over it to hide the evidence, and were now standing directly on top of the trapdoor. If they stayed quiet, they faced a judge who knew exactly what kind of monsters they were. If they spoke up, they confessed to new felonies that would guarantee them another decade in federal prison. He's got us, Donovan whimpered, tears of pure terror pricking the corners of his eyes. He didn't even have to do anything. We handed him the noose. Button your jackets, Conway said, his voice completely devoid of its usual confidence. We are going back out there, and you are going to pray to whatever God you believe in, that Judge Crawford believes in the law more than he believes in revenge. The trial of the state versus Graham Matthew and Brent Donovan did not become a circus of vengeance. It became something far worse for the defendants, an exhibition of flawless, suffocating jurisprudence. For the next 4 weeks, Judge Isaiah Crawford presided over the courtroom with the cold, mechanical precision of a surgical laser. He did not hurl insults from the bench. He did not make snide remarks. He gave the defense every single procedural leeway afforded to them under the Constitution, the very same Constitution Matthew and Donovan had wiped their boots on for 14 years. It was an agonizing psychological torture. Matthew sat at the defense table day after day, waiting for the axe to fall, waiting for the judge to show his hand. He waited for Crawford to sustain a baseless prosecution objection or to unfairly overrule Conway. But Crawford never did. When Conway made a valid legal argument regarding the admissibility of a piece of hearsay evidence, Crawford ruled in the defense's favor without hesitation. Objection sustained. The jury will disregard the witness's last statement. Crawford's voice boomed evenly. Every time Crawford ruled fairly, Matthew felt his stomach twist into a tighter knot. It was a terrifying realization. The judge didn't need to cheat to destroy them. The evidence was a mountain, and Crawford was simply ensuring that the avalanche buried them completely by the book, leaving zero grounds for a mistrial or an appeal. The prosecution, led by a sharp, relentless district attorney named David Reynolds meticulously dismantled the officers' lives. Reynolds brought forward the victims. He called terrified bodega owners who had been forced to pay Matthew hundreds of dollars a week in protection. Money to keep their shops from being vandalized by the very cops sworn to protect them. He brought forward young men who had been beaten in alleyways, their faces permanently scarred, while Donovan stood watch. The climax of the trial came during the third week, when the prosecution called Vincent Caldwell to the stand. Caldwell, the pawn shop owner, turned federal informant, looked nervous but determined. "Mr. Caldwell," Reynolds asked, pacing before the jury box, "can you tell the court what happened on the evening of August 14th? Officers Matthew and Donovan came into my shop after closing," Caldwell said, leaning into the microphone. "They said my federal tax problems could go away if I cut them in on 20% of my monthly electronics sales. When I told them I couldn't afford it, Officer Matthew drew his service weapon and placed it on my counter." "And did you capture this interaction on the recording equipment provided by the FBI?" Reynolds asked. "Yes, sir." "Your Honor, the state moves to introduce Exhibit 42B, the hidden camera footage from Caldwell's pawn," Reynolds stated. Conway stood up, desperate. "Objection, Your Honor. The chain of custody on the digital file is questionable and the audio is distorted. It is highly prejudicial." Judge Crawford looked at the paperwork before him. He then looked down at Conway, and finally his eyes drifted to Matthew. It was the same look he had given them from the back of the police cruiser 5 years ago, calm, calculating, and completely unbreakable. "I have reviewed the chain of custody logs provided by the federal agents who retrieved the device, Mr. Conway. They are immaculate," Judge Crawford stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Furthermore, the defense has had 3 months to have their own experts analyze the audio for tampering, which you haven't done. The probative value outweighs the prejudicial effect. Objection overruled. The state may play the tape." The courtroom lights dimmed. The large television screen mounted on the wall flickered to life. The footage was black and white, slightly grainy, but unmistakable. There were Matthew and Donovan in their tactical vests. The audio crackled, and then Matthew's voice filled the silent courtroom, arrogant and vicious. "You think the feds care about a scumbag like you, Vince? We are the law in this zip code. You breathe when we say you breathe. You pay when we say you pay. You cross us, and they'll find you floating in the harbor, and I'll be the one writing the report." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. The jury recoiled, looking at the defense table with overt disgust. Matthew shrunk in his chair. He looked up at the bench. Judge Crawford was watching the screen, his expression unreadable, completely devoid of triumph. He was simply watching the wheels of justice grind a corrupt man into dust. When the prosecution rested its case, Conway didn't even bother calling character witnesses. There was no one left in the city who would vouch for them. The police union had publicly distanced itself. Their former captain had testified against them for immunity. They were entirely alone. Closing arguments were a formality. Reynolds painted them as predators, masquerading as sheepdogs, betraying the badge and the city. Conway tried to argue that they were overzealous cops, pushed to the brink by a broken system, but his heart wasn't in it. As the jury was escorted out to begin deliberations, the bailiff called for recess. Matthew stood up, his legs trembling. He looked toward the bench as Judge Crawford gathered his files. For a brief, singular moment, the judge paused. He looked down at Matthew. The silence between them stretched across the crowded, bustling courtroom, a private frequency that only the two of them could hear. Crawford didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The message was clear in his unwavering gaze. "I told you, mistakes don't disappear." Matthew broke eye contact first, staring at the floor, a completely broken man. The arrogant cop who had ruled the midnight highways was gone, replaced by a terrified convict waiting for the cage to lock. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreperson, an older woman with stern glasses, stood up and held a slip of paper. "On the count of racketeering, how do you find?" the clerk asked. "Guilty." "On the count of extortion under the color of official right?" "Guilty." "On the count of aggravated assault?" "Guilty." The word repeated, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat sealing their doom. 32 counts, 32 guilties. Donovan openly wept, burying his face in his hands. Matthew just stared blankly ahead, numb, the reality of decades behind bars finally crushing the last of his breath. "The jury has spoken, and the court accepts the verdicts," Judge Crawford said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. He looked down at the two men. "The defendants are remanded entirely into state custody without bail. Sentencing will be held in 2 weeks. Judge Crawford struck his gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed like thunder, a final, definitive end to their reign of terror. "Court is adjourned." As the bailiffs moved in to cuff Matthew and Donovan, clicking the cold steel tightly around their wrists, ignoring their discomfort, Matthew looked back one last time. The bench was empty. The judge was gone, having delivered his justice, leaving the 2 corrupt cops exactly where they had left him 5 years ago. In chains. 2 weeks passed. For Graham Matthew and Brent Donovan, those 14 days in the county jail's administrative segregation unit, a protective custody wing reserved for high-profile inmates and disgraced law enforcement, felt like 14 lifetimes. Stripped of their tailored suits, their badges, and the terrifying authority they once wielded, they wore standard-issue orange jumpsuits. The heavy iron doors of their cells clanged with the same horrifying finality they had so casually inflicted upon countless others. The morning of the sentencing hearing, a heavy, oppressive grey fog rolled off the bay, blanketing the city in a miserable drizzle. It was poetically similar to the weather on that fateful night 5 years prior on Interstate 95. Courtroom 302 was packed to absolute capacity. There was not a single empty wooden bench. Local news anchors, civil rights advocates, and dozens of the victims Matthew and Donovan had terrorized over the past decade crowded the gallery. The air was thick with anticipation. When the side door opened and the bailiffs led the 2 disgraced officers in, shackled at the wrists and ankles, the gallery erupted into a low, rumbling murmur. The sound of chains dragging across the polished wood floor was a stark, brutal contrast to the arrogant swagger the men had displayed during their arraignment. Matthew looked gaunt. The stress had aged him a decade in a matter of weeks. Donovan kept his eyes glued to the floor, physically trembling. "All rise." Judge Isaiah Crawford entered the courtroom. He moved with the same deliberate, unhurried grace he always possessed. He took his seat, adjusted his microphone, and looked out over the sea of faces before settling his dark, impenetrable gaze on the defense table. "Be seated," Judge Crawford commanded softly. The room instantly fell into a pin-drop silence. "We are here for the sentencing in the matter of the state versus Graham Matthew and Brent Donovan. Mr. Reynolds, does the state wish to be heard before I hand down the sentence?" District Attorney David Reynolds stood up, buttoning his jacket. "We do, Your Honor. The state has submitted victim impact statements for the court's review, but I will be brief. The men sitting at that table did not just break the law. They broke the sacred trust between the citizens of this city and the badge they wore. They used their authority not as a shield to protect the vulnerable, but as a sword to bleed them dry. They planted evidence. They extorted small business owners like Vincent Caldwell. and they brutalized those who dared to question them. The state requests the absolute maximum sentence allowed by law to be served consecutively. To do anything less would be an insult to the uniform they disgraced. Reynolds sat down. The gallery let out a collective breath. Mr. Conway, Judge Crawford turned to the defense attorney. Does the defense wish to address the court? Lawrence Conway stood slowly. He looked defeated. Your Honor, we acknowledge the severity of the jury's verdict. However, we ask the court to remember that for 14 years, Graham Matthew and Brent Donovan put their lives on the line. They worked in the most dangerous, unforgiving sectors of this city. The psychological toll of that environment, it changes a man. We ask for a degree of mercy. We ask that the sentences run concurrently, allowing these men some sliver of hope that they might one day return to society as rehabilitated men. Conway sat back down. Matthew slowly stood up, gripping the table with shaking hands. Your Honor, I want to apologize to the department. I lost my way. His voice was hollow, a pathetic echo of the commanding bark he used to wield. Judge Crawford watched him for a long, silent moment. The silence stretched, pulling tight like a piano wire. Are you finished, Mr. Matthew? Judge Crawford asked, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Crawford leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy mahogany bench. He did not look at his notes. He looked directly into Graham Matthews' eyes and then shifted to Brent Donovan. You asked this court to consider the environment you worked in as a mitigating factor for your descent into corruption, Judge Crawford began, his voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre that carried effortlessly to the back of the room. You speak of the psychological toll of the streets. But this court has sat through weeks of testimony, and what I saw was not the behavior of traumatized public servants. I saw predators. Matthew swallowed hard, his eyes wide. A badge is a heavy piece of metal, Mr. Matthew, Judge Crawford continued, his words striking like perfectly aimed arrows. It represents the immense power the state grants a single individual, the power to stop a citizen, the power to detain them, the power to strip them of their freedom, put them in chains, and lock them in a concrete cage. Donovan let out a quiet, trembling gasp. The specific phrasing was not lost on either of the defendants. The memory of the rain, the silver Mercedes, and the cold handcuffs suddenly roared back into their minds with agonizing clarity. When you abuse that power, Judge Crawford said, his eyes locking onto Matthew with an intensity that made the disgraced cop want to sink into the floorboards. You do not just commit a crime, you commit an act of tyranny. You operated under the delusion that because you wore a uniform, you were untouchable. You believed that if you pulled someone over in the dark of night on an empty stretch of highway where no one was watching, you could do whatever you pleased simply because you held the keys. Matthew's breath hitched. He knew. In that moment, looking up at the man in the black robe, Matthew knew exactly what Crawford was doing. The judge was not breaking the rules. He was not mentioning the unlawful arrest that had been wiped from the books. He was delivering a legally sound, profoundly poetic judgment that simultaneously served as a personal execution of Matthew's past sins. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. It was absolute karma. You thought the victims you targeted had no voice, Judge Crawford continued. You thought the people you threw into the dark would never find their way out to stand in the light. But justice is a patient concept, gentlemen. It waits, it watches, and eventually the wheel turns. Judge Crawford picked up a stack of sentencing documents. On the counts of aggravated assault, I sentence you both to 15 years. On the counts of extortion under the colour of official right, I sentence you to 20 years. On the counts of racketeering, I sentence you to 25 years. The judge paused, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. These sentences are to run consecutively, not concurrently. You will serve a total of 60 years in the state penitentiary, without the possibility of parole. You are remanded into the custody of the Department of Corrections to begin serving your sentences immediately. Judge Crawford raised his gavel. May God have mercy on your souls, because this court has none to spare. Crack! The sound of the gavel hitting the block shattered the silence. The gallery erupted in cheers, tears, and applause. Victims hugged each other. David Reynolds let out a long sigh of relief. Matthew's legs completely gave out. He collapsed backward into his chair, his mouth open in a silent scream of despair. 60 years. He was 46 years old. He was going to die in a cage. Donovan was already sobbing uncontrollably, his head resting on the defense table. "On your feet," the bailiffs ordered gruffly, hauling the two sobbing, broken men up by their armpits. As they were dragged toward the side door, Matthew turned his head back one final time. Through the chaotic celebration of the courtroom, his eyes met Judge Crawford's. The judge was simply watching them go, his expression calm, dignified, and totally at peace. The intake processing center at the Oak Haven State Penitentiary smelled exactly like the 42nd Precinct holding cell, a sickening blend of bleach, sweat, and despair. Graham Matthew stood shivering in a cold, sterile room. A corrections officer with dead eyes tossed a coarse, scratchy orange uniform onto the metal counter. "Strip. Cough. Put the jumpsuit on," the guard ordered, his tone flat and utterly indifferent. Matthew looked at the guard. He wanted to say, "I used to be a cop. I used to be somebody." But the words died in his throat. In this building, he wasn't a cop. He was just inmate 88419. He was the prey now. The iron door of his 6x8 cell slammed shut behind him with a deafening metallic crash, echoing the sound of his own ruined life. He sat on the thin mattress, pulled his knees to his chest, and buried his face in his hands as the reality of the next 6 decades set in. Miles away, the city was settling into the evening. The rain had finally stopped, and the setting sun cast a golden, victorious hue across the skyline. In his private chambers, Judge Isaiah Crawford stood before a tall oak mirror. He slowly unzipped his heavy black robe, pulling it off his shoulders and draping it carefully over a mahogany hanger. Beneath it, he wore a crisp, tailored navy blue suit. There was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," Isaiah said. Daniel Hayes, the senior law partner who had picked Isaiah up from the precinct 5 years ago, stepped into the office. Daniel's hair was a little grayer now, but his smile was wide and genuine. "I was in the gallery today, Isaiah," Daniel said, walking over and pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water from a crystal decanter on the side table. "I have never seen a courtroom command so much respect. You handed down exactly what they deserved." Isaiah took a glass, looking out the large window at the city below. "They built their own cages, Daniel. I merely locked the door." "Did they figure it out?" Daniel asked quietly, stepping up beside him. "Did they realize who you were?" Isaiah took a sip of the water, a faint ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. He remembered the look of sheer, unadulterated terror on Matthew's face when the realization had hit him. He remembered the feeling of the gavel in his hand, heavier than any physical object, holding the absolute weight of justice. "Yes," Isaiah replied softly. "They knew. And the beauty of it is, they couldn't say a single word about it without hanging themselves faster. They were defeated by the very system they thought they controlled. Daniel chuckled, raising his glass in a small toast. To patience. To the law, Isaiah corrected gently, clinking his glass against his mentor's. Isaiah Crawford turned back to his desk. He packed his briefcase, turned off the brass lamp, and walked out of his chambers. He took the private elevator down to the secure parking garage, where his silver Mercedes was waiting. As he drove out onto the highway, heading toward Oakley Estates, the evening sky was clear, and the road ahead was wide open. True power is not found in the volume of a scream or the brutality of a closed fist. The tragedy of corrupt men like Graham Matthew and Brent Donovan is that they mistook cruelty for strength and a badge for a crown. They believed that the darkness of a lonely highway could hide their sins, failing to realize that the victims they discarded would one day rise to write their final chapters. Judge Isaiah Crawford didn't need to lower himself to their level of violence or corruption to exact his revenge. Instead, he weaponized his patience, his brilliance, and his unwavering dedication to the law. He turned the very system they abused into an inescapable trap. Karma rarely arrives with flashing lights. Sometimes it sits quietly in a black robe, holding a wooden gavel, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the floor from beneath you.